we are here to talk about the hits, misses, and everything in between of the budget 2018, which was unveiled last Friday. Right. So with me on the panel is Nur Hisham Hussain, General Manager, Economics and Capital Markets at Employees Provident Fund. Thanks for being here.
To take care of all our money.
Yeah. And then next to me is Ong Kian Ming, right, General Manager at the Penang Institute.
Thanks for
KL.
inviting me.
Yeah, no problem. And next to me over here is our very own Lee Ching Wei, CEO of iMoney. And next to him over there, you're a very familiar face, Ibrahim Sufyan, Director at the Merdeka Center. So thanks guys, thanks for being here. All right.
Pleasure.
All right, so guys, you know the drill, right? So you ask the questions and we'll try out how best to answer them as much as we can, right? So, are you ready? Right. Let's hit it off with our first question. Now, the first question is basically on the operation expenditure, right? 84% development expenditure, 16%. Now, it's been observed that the OPEX was on the rise for 2 consecutive years. But operating surplus on average has shrunk to an average of 3.6 billion per year from 2008 to 2018. So does this underscore the lack of fiscal commitment to restrain operational expenditure? Hisham, what do you think?
I don't think so. I mean, if you look at the growth of OPEX, it's roughly around 6-point-something%, I think.
Right.
Yeah. But if you look at it in relation to GDP, it's actually dropping.
Okay.
And it has been for the last 5 years. So, my view is that you look at the long-term commitments that the government has, or let me put it another way: if we want to be the society that we want to be, and that would require a bit more in terms of social spending from the government, in terms of education, in terms of healthcare. So, just a reduction in operating expenditure. I mean, even relative to development expenditure, to me, it shows the government is committed to fiscal consolidation. But I have questions about whether fiscal consolidation is really necessary.
I think we need to look at the details and the breakdown of the OPEX as well, because you have, let's say, the emoluments that you have to pay out to the civil servants. That is more or less fixed amount. It obviously rises every year because of wage increments and all that. And then you have another part that is you have to pay to pensions, something that we talked about just now. So that is also more or less set. I think where perhaps you can try to maybe reduce some of the corruption and wastage would be in the supplies and services section, whereby the government is supposed to tender out different contracts and whatnot. Maybe that part can reduce a little bit.
That's something like 10 or 12% of the budget overall. Well, of OPEX actually. Yeah, I mean, it's a big portion. Yeah. But then some of it is actually medical supplies, so sometimes you can't avoid it.
Well, medical supplies, sometimes you have to go through monopolies like Pharmaniaga and whatnot. So there's always some room for you to maneuver, but it really depends on where exactly you're talking about in terms of the OPEX.
Right. Now, many obviously are calling this an election budget. Ibrahim Sufyan, what's your take on that?
Well, I think if you look at the budget specifically in terms of who's getting the benefits, it's clearly intended to persuade many segments of the key target population that the government is trying to meet their needs.
Right.
I think the government is very well aware that members of the public are very concerned, are stressed by cost of living, wages that aren't growing fast enough to meet rising costs and so on. And so if you look at the budget, it's very clear that there is a target to persuade or safeguard the base. We have allocations for the Felda settlers, 5,000 new homes, Felda settlers, a promise of a 2-part bonus for retirees and civil servants. That's an important, strong base for the government. In the last election, 2/3 or more of them voted for the government party. And then what surprised me was that there was also a tax cut for the M40, the M40, which by and large, they don't really go that far to support the government. But I just feel that the government is trying to say that, look, I'm not just taking care of the base, but I'm also trying to meet the hardworking families of Malaysia.
Exactly.
Yes.
So we were chatting before, right? The tax cut, while perception-wise it seems to really be targeting the 20k to 70k, sort of range, but actually applies to everyone.
Right.
So everyone benefited from this tax cut, which,
Well, I mean, if you look at it in the context of, say, the KL or the developed economy, yeah, that's the M40. But if you look at it in a wider context of the whole population of Malaysia, we're actually talking about the top 20 already. So
yeah, of those who actually pay income
Yeah,
tax.
they're only 15% of the people pay income tax
exactly.
anyway. So really, it's just talking about we are the top 20%, 15-20%.
Right.
Really. So I think that for the rest of the people, the one part of the budget that kind of surprised me that there wasn't a larger BREAM allocation.
Yeah.
I was expecting that the BREAM allocation would be tweaked a bit to cater for the upcoming election. I mean, it's been set at 1,200, and BREAM is the favorite topic of ours. Every time the BREAM comes out, we will actually run a poll at the same time because we want to measure the bump in terms of support. I think there is a kind of phenomenon, diminishing returns phenomenon as far as political mileage is concerned. So we thought that coming this budget, the dosage need to be increased a bit to get a larger bump ahead of the election, but the same dosage is 1,200 for the top rate. So I'm a bit concerned if I were, in those constituents where large recipients of BREAM are located, because the amount hasn't changed compared to past elections.
And I was surprised that maybe the minimum wage wasn't adjusted upwards a little bit. It's still.
Well, I think to be fair to the because the process of the minimum wage is actually quite convoluted. You have to go through the NWCC, and there's it's a tripartite consultation between employers, employees, and the government is basically just the referee. So they adjusted it last year, in the middle of last year. So by law, they have to review it within
3 years.
2 to 3 years. So I don't think that's something that the government can actually mandate on its own. They actually have to go through the consultation process first.
Right, good. Now we have our first question. It's from Muhammad Afif. And it's to Mr. Nur Hisham. Is tax reform feasible for the future? E.g., taxing people with many stocks, CGT, increasing tax for corporate, inheritance tax, etc.
I should hope so. I am crossing my fingers that we can do it. But there is a political reality that it has to be something that the people accept, and that is something that we haven't had that much larger discussion publicly about tax reform. And it's not just at the federal government level, but also at the state government level, because right now state governments rely almost wholly on property taxes. Or
land-related taxes.
Land-related taxes. So that causes some distortions in the housing market and for businesses as well. And it's not fair to the states either, because they're restricted in terms of what they can do. So that's another discussion that we also need to have. But tax reform, definitely, I think that's something that we need to move forward with. Absolutely.
I think the opposition Pakatan Harapan had brought up in the past the possibility of introducing a capital gains tax. I think Hisham also
yes, I've been a big supporter
has discussed that before. And I think we need to compare to other developed countries. The US, for example, one of the largest recipients of equity investment, including from EPF, they have a CGT. Even at the state level in California, for example, where a lot of the .coms are based, they also have a capital gains tax, especially when you list your company and whatnot. So I think it's something that we need to discuss and weigh the pros and cons, and also devolution of power to the states in terms of collecting back some of the tax revenue, as well as having some more responsibility in areas like education and healthcare, for example.
All right. Good. Well, here's another one for you, man. I mean, you're very famous with your readers.
People are concerned about EPF.
I think so.
Your money is safe.
All right, so this is from Sebastian Lowe. I like your take on Pakatan's alternative budget, in particular on the minimum wage and immigration. Would their proposal to raise the minimum wage to 1,500 ringgit lead to a considerable spike in prices? Wouldn't the primary beneficiaries be foreign workers, not locals? And wouldn't businesses just pass the wage increase on to consumers? Also, with higher operating costs for businesses, wouldn't that lead to higher unemployment and slower economic activity? There's also let's handle this part.
Okay.
Thanks, Sebastian, for watching. We love you.
All right. I'll be honest, I haven't read it yet.
Okay.
Yeah, because I was actually away most of last week. as far as raising the minimum wage to 1,005, it can be done, but you have to phase it, right? At this stage, I think a 10% increase is warranted,
Right.
to about 1,001. But you can raise it to about 1,005, I think, within the next 3 or 4 years, and you won't have the kind of negative effects that you've been talking about. But it's something that we have to be careful about.
Okay.
Because there is a possibility of unemployment, there is the possibility of raising prices. Also, I just like to point out that the people who are actually getting minimum wage is actually a fairly small subset of the total labor force.
All right.
Right?
Yeah, maybe about 300,000 people.
Yeah, 300,000 people.
Out of a labor force of 15 million people.
Yeah, and out of that 15 million, you're talking about roughly about 40% might be in the informal sector. The minimum wage doesn't do anything for that. So
These are your pasar malam,
yeah, exactly.
Traders.
Exactly. And even within the salaried worker system, I mean, within the EPF system, we have about 7 million active members.
Right.
Now, out of that, I think about 25% don't have regular contributions, which means they don't get a wage on a regular basis.
Right.
So they actually fall below the minimum wage level. They might be part-time workers. In other words, they get the minimum wage on an hourly basis. Right? So even raising it for them might not be a big enough bump in terms of cost to have the kind of negative effects you're talking about. But also you might not get the kind of income effects that we're looking for.
Right.
So there has to be a larger discussion about what we can do in terms of raising incomes. The minimum wage is just one tool, but it can't cover everybody, and it won't do the everything. I mean, we're not a developed economy with the kind of developed economy, industrial type of labor force that they have.
Right.
So the effects are going to be a lot more muted.
Right. Kevin,
Yeah, since I was part of the committee that drafted the alternative budget,
Why not?
what was perhaps not made clear during our briefing session to the media was that it would be like what Hisham said, staged, and also we proposed that the government share the cost with the employers. You are talking about a relatively small number of people, slightly over 300,000, and if we want to increase it to 1,005, our proposal is that the government pays half of that increase, and then the employers pay half of the increase. In terms of let's say rising costs, the way we manage it is that we will take away GST, and that would take away some of the pressures for employees to want to pass on the cost to the consumers, the employees to the consumers. And I think one thing we need to realize is that Hisham brought up the issue of the National Wages Consultative Council. In the Malaysian context, the NWCC only has the right to set the minimum wage. But whereas in Singapore, for example, they actually have the responsibility, their version of NWCC has the responsibility of trying to increase wages across sectors at all levels.
Okay.
Right? So actually that's something that we really want to strengthen the NWCC so that there is a genuine tripartite effort that has trust within the employers, employees as well as the government to slowly increase wages over time. Right now, I don't think the trust is there.
Yeah, no, but because that was an interesting point, because we've had consultations with the ILO and I think some other organizations about how we can get more consultation going. And one of the issues, of course, is that the labor movement in Malaysia is quite
Very
small.
weak. It's very weak.
We're talking about 800,000 and 900,000 members out of the 15 million labor force. So even though the labor movement is with the NWCC, they might not be representative of the total labor force. And we need to get those other people in as well.
I think it's more than that if you include the civil servants.
Yes. Yeah, but you're still talking about maybe 20% of the labor force that will actually be represented. So I think that we need to put a little bit more thought into that as well.
All right, great. And now also part two of that question. So there's also their proposal to slash the number of foreign workers in Malaysia. What impact would that have on prices? I understand that there's an argument for investing in mechanization as opposed to relying on foreign labor. How do you mechanize serving food at your mama or laying bricks at a construction site? Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, great. I've seen restaurants already responding to that challenge. Some of them are doing self-service. They'll just put the food out there and say, you just serve yourself. Right?
Yeah.
So that gets rid of some of the workers. And I think we're starting to see vending machines actually doing part of the job.
Self-service laundries.
Yes, exactly. And I think businesses are responding to that challenge. So can we get rid of them? Yeah, I think so. There are certain areas that might be a bit difficult. plantations, for example. It would be quite hard to get rid of the labor element.
Yeah.
But yeah, well my view is that I'm generally pro-immigration anyway.
Okay.
And if you really want to get rid of foreign workers, then the best thing to do is actually invest in their home countries. We built up Myanmar, we built up Bangladesh, and they don't have to come here.
I think it's important to state that it's not getting rid of them, but reducing the number of foreign workers over time, especially the number of illegal foreign workers, which is anywhere between 2 to 4 million, which is
depending who you talk to.
Yes, exactly. Even the government doesn't really know. I've received different replies in Parliament,
Right.
so I think that's something that we need to consider as well.
Now, since we are on employment, and so I guess let's talk about the maternity leave. I mean, so Ching, the 90 days. Well, will it affect productivity and cost for the employers?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting announcement, isn't it? I think many companies certainly didn't expect that. Now, it's probably worth stating that we at iMoney have implemented this even well before the government announced it. When we looked at neighboring countries, countries like Indonesia, Philippines, what we realized was Malaysia actually had one of the shortest maternity leave, right? So I think just from that perspective, it's bringing it up to standard. Short term, certainly there may be some adjustments that companies might face, but I think longer term, if you look at research around the world, there hasn't been any proof or evidence that this would lead to a lower scenario where there's lower productivity. In fact, on the contrary, I think there's enough research study that shows that by doing this, you increase employee happiness, motivation, but also increase female participation in the workforce. So,
and I think that's the goal.
Yeah.
Actually, Ching, would you consider implementing a policy where you can actually transfer if husband and wife are both working in the company, you can transfer the maternity leave to the father,
That's look, that's an interesting one, and I saw that. I don't know, we don't have such situation.
Because I think in Scandinavia, what they do is that both
we
parents
can share. Yes, I read about that.
Share it out. More equitable.
But I think it's not just that, right? It's also the fact that there's the whole encouragement on childcare centres. It's about bringing back people who have troubles with, obviously getting back into employment after having a child. So I think it's generally a good move to increase, participation.
What do you think about that, right?
No, I think it's a very positive move because it encourages female participation in the workforce, and women are increasingly, I think, holding positions of more importance in decision making in companies and so on. And I think another level is that women also make up a larger proportion of our tertiary educated students and so on. So it allows them to actually enter the workforce, and then it helps with employee retention, because I think a lot of mothers, a lot of women who end up becoming mothers, want to opt out and spend more time with their children. But having more time to in the post-natal situation addresses this problem. And I think beyond that, I think there'll be further demands in terms of childcare services and time out for parental
flexible working arrangement.
Working arrangement. But I think this is a very positive step, something that will be welcomed by the public.
Right. And speaking of kids, there was the Adam 50, right? That was mentioned in the budget. Now, how is this helpful to people? I mean, I understand that the Adam 50 is a unit trust, right, with PNB, right? So you have 200 ringgit per child, right? And then I'm assuming it'll grow over time. Yeah. So how is this helpful? Because if you're looking at the returns, would that how would that address?
Well, 200 ringgit on its own doesn't do as much. But there's a couple of things here. One is the financial aspect of it in encouraging that savings habit very, very early.
Okay.
Because I think PNB as a whole, even for things like ESB, you're allowed to open an account at 6 months old already. So just going another 6 months, it's a great idea. The other aspect of it is, of course, that I would say that sense of ownership in terms of being a citizen.
Okay.
Right? To say that this child is Malaysian and he has certain rights and certain things that they're entitled to, and I think that brings us a little bit closer together. as a nation.
Okay.
So it operates on a few levels, I think.
All right.
I think I want to add to that. Many Malaysians are actually from low-income families. I mean, I've been in situations where we visit people, in Sabah, in Sarawak, in the rural areas, and the kids do well in school, and they get a posting from UPU to study in Jitra, for example, from Sandakan to go to Jitra, and comes from a poor family, and they don't have savings.
Jitra and Kedah, in case
Yeah.
listeners may not know where it is.
To go across, and that probably will they need to cough up about 1,500 to 2,000 ringgit to make the move, over there, and the parents can't afford it.
Yeah.
So in the lower, the bottom 40, and especially if you go to the bottom 20%, where I think most families literally have very little in the way of savings. Things like this.
Yeah, fantastic.
Help. It goes a long way. It helps to pay for the bus fare or the airfare, helps to get them ahead.
Yeah, just to add to that, the Selangor state government
Yeah,
already
Tawas.
has a problem. Already has a problem. The problem would be that a lot of kids are applying for this program. You talked about Tawas.
Tawas,
when you're born, you get 100 ringgit, and then it accumulates up to
1,500. Yeah.
Yes, by the time you're 18, you can withdraw. And also for kids from low-income families, first kid who goes to university, the Selangor state government will give a cash incentive of 1,000 ringgit to help with some of these moving costs that Ben was talking about.
Right.
Of course, that's only for Selangor, it's not for the rest of the country.
But which would be a better option for parents moving forward? I mean, the Adam 50 or the...
I think for the Adam 50, you cannot withdraw it immediately.
Yeah.
You only can withdraw it later on, and I think it's the same for the Tawas scheme as well. So the important thing is that you factor into this whatever finances that you need to set aside to make sure that
I mean, if you look at the household income survey, I think roughly around 50% of the bottom 50% have no financial assets at all.
Exactly. So this sort of
It helps.
It gives a head start.
It gives a head start,
And I think we're trying to move a little bit beyond that. It's not just on the financial aspects of it, but also on the education and stuff like that. We were discussing some of these things on the Tier 50.
Right.
So
Financial literacy.
Yes.
Great.
Proper nutrition. A lot of we're trying to operate on a lot of different levels.
Right. Jing, so would this be a catalyst to push parents to start saving and investing for the children? What do you think?
Look, I think it depends, and great points. I think it really depends on the subgroup of people. There will be those that for 200 ringgit, this is a substantial sum, right? And I think there'll be those that it'll be a nice by the way sort of income, and that could potentially increase in terms of awareness of investments, right? I think it's probably not something you look at and 200 within 18 years you grow to a certain sum. It's not quite an equation that one would probably see it that way, but I think if it fostered a habit or at least a perception of having put aside money to invest for the future, I think that could be good.
Great. Right. Now, I mean, let's talk about the tolls, the removal of the 4 toll plazas, right? Now, one observation was that especially with the Sungai Tawas and the Batutiga tolls, right? Some of them were questioning the removal of those 2 toll plazas because that area itself will be facilitated by the LRT3, so it's public transport there. So some of them are asking, isn't it a bit schizophrenic to use that word, to remove the tolls, but at the same time try to encourage people to use public transportation? Well, what are your thoughts on that?
Let me take that first because I've written a little bit about the removal of the tolls. I don't think it's schizophrenic in the sense that you have areas that are not covered by public transportation right now, and the LRT3 will take some years to build. And on, let's say, the Batutiga toll, they've been collecting money toll there for the better part of 20 years. The original expiry date of that toll concession was supposed to be 2018.
Right.
And then, because Plus was privatized, it was extended to 2038. So I think this example clearly shows that if, let's say, the government has enough political will, you can actually abolish toll and pay compensation to the toll operators at a rate which can benefit the larger public. So I think it's something which we propose, not just abolishing tolls at Batutiga, but also nationwide. And people can contest whether we can do it or not. But I think we can, based on some of these examples that the government has shown themselves.
Well, I can't really comment on that because we are obviously own plus. So.
51%.
49.
49.
So I mean, there are pros and cons.
Yeah.
Two sides.
How about you, Ibrahim?
Well, I think it's. I look at the whole toll removal from a socio-political standpoint.
Yes.
I mean, those locations happen to be, with the exception of, let's say, the Bukit Kayu Hitam toll, which is near the Thai border, the other three tolls are located in potentially marginal districts.
Shalam,
Shalam, the whole Shalam, Bukit Raja, Kota Raja, and then also the eastern dispersal link, basically
Patah.
covers Gelang Patah, all the way the southern bit of Johor around JB. Those are all seats that were won or lost by either party with less than 5% of the vote.
Right.
And and this is going to be, I think, a very contested election. And so I look at it from a standpoint of this is perhaps a portfolio of specific strategies to persuade voters that the government is concerned about them, is trying to address the issues. So you have a portfolio of things such as removing the tolls, improving the public transport situation, measures such as redistricting, redrawing the boundaries and so on, which I think will materialize in the next few months, and all of those things, which in and of itself perhaps it wouldn't swing the needle that much, but when you take it in its entirety, perhaps who knows, it might tilt things in someone's favor. So we think that it's a fairly calculated move. Three-corner fights.
Yeah, okay. All right. Okay. So
That's a big one.
Yeah, I gotta bring it back in. All right. So, so now someone observed the budget 2018 seems to be more beneficial to the rich, with tax exemption on rental income and other perks for investors in venture capitalist companies. What's the panel's take on this? Who wants to start first?
Don't forget the tax exemptions for buying planes and big yachts. And things
Yeah.
like that.
Did you want to chip in?
No.
Because they say that one of the general comments is that it's there's a slice for everyone, right?
I think based on our previous discussion, the fact that the government has reduced the income taxes for the M40 is a positive move. But I will also note that the government also projects an increase in the overall income tax collection, including personal income taxes.
Yeah.
So I think people should be not so happy yet because from anecdotal evidence and also from some of the reports that we see in the press, even as the government is reducing these the income taxes for the M40, I think the IRB, the Internal Revenue Board, will be much more harsher in trying to chase down people who supposedly owe money. So, many of my friends have been hit by this, including many in the M40 category.
Right. Hisham, how do you explain that? I mean, a reduction, but then there's also a projection of growth in tax revenue. So how does that?
It's been a decent year.
All right.
Okay. And our numbers indicate that contributions are rising strongly, which is indicative that wages are rising strongly. Okay. It is in pockets. Okay. Unfortunately, it's not that broad-based. So I think, the income tax collection is basically just coming from the fact that incomes are rising,
right,
and will be rising. I think bonuses next year will be decent compared to this year.
Right.
And this year was still okay. I think the pressure is off in terms of both government and households.
Okay.
Global growth is, for once in probably the past decade, it's synchronized. Everybody's growing now. Trade is growing. So it's a much more benign environment than we've seen for the last 3 years.
Hopefully Donald Trump doesn't do anything.
There's always North Korea. There's a whole lot of risk factors involved. I mean,
right.
Kurdistan tried to declare independence. That could affect oil prices. There's the Spanish Catalan referendum. There's North Korea. There's still a lot of risk factors. But if nothing goes wrong, then it'll be a decent year for everybody, I think. And that's one reason why the government revenues are still on the rise.
Interesting. Yeah, speaking of GST, you guys want to abolish the GST, right? So what's the rationale behind that?
I think when we communicate to the public, our communication is that we will abolish it. But I think your readers, your listeners are more sophisticated. The plan for us is actually to zero-rise GST and to return to the SST regime. And many people have criticized us on a number of fronts, probably including
I haven't had the chance yet.
And I want to explain a little bit about this zero-risation. It addresses issues like, are you going to get rid of the GST system? No, we're going to use whatever we have now. Will it let's say, allow people to avoid tax, because they have previously not been paying tax under the SST system? No, I said they are reporting under the GST. It's just a matter of decreasing the number of goods that are going to be taxed under the current GST regime and exempting a lot of things and zero-rising a lot of things. So the amount is actually not that large. I think in the whole scheme of things, about 25 billion ringgit that we have to plug. But I think we can do it from a number of measures that we've outlined in our budget, including most importantly, reducing corruption and also wastage.
Right, so hold on. So Hisham, what's your take on that bit, on the GST bit first, before we go into that whole corruption and...
I think, because my perspective tends to be long-term, because I'm a pension fund, so we tend to link long-term. And I think the government has to start thinking about, and I said this at the panel yesterday with the Treasury Secretary, government really has to think about what kind of challenges they're going to be facing over the next 20, 30 years as we run up to 2050. And as I mentioned before, we need to boost healthcare, we need to boost education, we need to cover the pensions gap, right? There is the fact that, despite having EPF, despite having QAP, despite having LTAT, roughly around over 50% of the people of working age today in Malaysia have no pension coverage at all. And that's a gap that we really need to fill. There is the fact that healthcare is rising at 6% per capita per annum, right? And the population is aging very, very rapidly. Within the next 20 years, I think something like 15% or close to 20% of the population is going to be past retirement age. And most of the healthcare costs actually come in the last 2 years of life. Life expectancy is rising. The family structure is breaking down, right? So family sizes are actually decreasing. Quite a few more people are not getting married at all, have no children at all.
Divorce rates are increasing.
And divorce rates are increasing. Right. So there is that the model that we're used to, where the kids take care of the parents, is going to break down in the near future, and we have to be ready for that. And that all requires a lot more in terms of fiscal resources to manage. So my perspective is, I'd rather raise taxes right now.
Right now.
And that's the hugely unpopular thing to say. But
that's why he's not a politician.
That's why he's
exactly. So I could say the unpopular thing. But I would rather we really start thinking about how we're going to be able to raise these fiscal resources to address the kind of challenges we're going to face in the future. And the other aspect of it, if you're looking at it from the income side, you talk about the gig economy, you talk about the digital economy, you talk about Industry 4.0. And one of the things that's been going on there is that we're going to see a reversion in a sense of how the labor force is actually organized in terms of industrial organization. We're shifting from the salaried worker model back to the kind of model that we had prior to the Industrial Revolution, which is that as a skilled worker, you work for many people. You do on a project basis, you do on a part-time basis, you do on a freelance basis. And that's going to pose a lot of challenges to the government in terms of tax collection, right? Because you no longer just can take away somebody's, get somebody's salary away at the employer level. Because now you're talking about many, many different employers, and some of them will be overseas. There's a lot of gig work now where you just go online on some platforms and you're working for somebody in Belgium or Germany or the United States. And where does the tax collection happen in that sense? And who actually collects the taxes? Is it the American, the Belgian, or the German, or us? Right? So there's a lot of fiscal challenges that are going to go around in the future, and I think we really need to sit down and think about that.
So very interesting. How about you, Ibrahim? What's your perspective of this whole?
Well, I mean, with respect to the GST, of course, it's a very unpopular introduction that happened 2-3 years ago, and that has significantly affected government popularity. So any kind of move to reduce or zero-rise it is bound to be popular by I think, a big chunk of the voting public. But I think the public also has to be persuaded, how the government is going to meet its obligations with that kind of a shortfall. And so it's a situation where I think people are pondering. We have a situation where, yes, the opposition, it has run several states and run some of them very well, but it also does not have, experience at the federal level. So that's going to be challenging for this to be sold to the public. On the flip side of it, having the GST also introduces, I think, a new way of educating the public about how things work, because now everybody's paying tax. By right, everybody ought to be invested in terms of how their tax money is spent.
Absolutely.
And we've seen increasing evidence of that even when we speak to people in the most remote area of the country, suddenly they worry about the 60 cents they pay after their prepaid phone top up. How is spending this money? Is it going to bail out that guy or whatever? And people are having this conversation. So suddenly, it has a democratizing effect. People suddenly are invested in governance, and I think that's a good thing in total. But I think whether or not it gets implemented is another issue. But I think people are, keen to follow this debate.
At least they're talking about it.
Right, so we have one from Nur Hana Othman. What does the panel think about the introduction of voluntary health insurance? How is it different from existing insurance schemes? Who wants to take a stab at that?
Okay, I'll make a go of this because I also made some comments about this. There was a proposal to introduce a voluntary health insurance scheme by the health minister sometime last year. And I think the minister said voluntary because he was afraid of the backlash that would occur if, let's say, we had this repeat of One Care, which was supposed to be a compulsory mandatory health insurance service. The argument that's made is one that I can find some sympathy for. What Hisham said, aging population, we're going to have more healthcare costs. The government is not going to be able to take care of all these things. There's cost inflation as well. So, if we can move towards a health insurance scheme whereby you can take some of that burden off the government sector, it may be helpful. But I think my concern would be that this health insurance scheme may be introduced as a way to try to help the private hospitals make more money. Because I think the private hospitals are, many of them are also, owned by the government in some ways. And they want a piece of the pie as well. So if, let's say, you do introduce something that's voluntary on the way to being, let's say, more broad-based, they will want to see that some of the revenue shifted from government hospitals to the private hospitals. And whether or not that is affordable, I think it's something that we need to discuss.
So that's one of the reasons why we're following the Obamacare debate in the United States quite closely. And I think we really need to, insurance is one thing, but I think we really need to think about what kind of healthcare model that we really want in the future. Because right now, is the dual model that we have now, where we have private and public, is that the way forward? And is that the most cost-effective way of delivering healthcare? So, that debate is still something that we need to have.
It actually gets very technical, very complicated.
But healthcare is one of the most complicated topics, right? To really get it right.
Because you got financing on one side, but you really have to talk about what the cost of delivery is.
Exactly. But I think one thing to recognize is healthcare cost is rising, right? Just generally, and the allocation to healthcare hasn't really changed if you think about it in the budget.
It has actually. This year it has.
It's increased.
It's increased, right? A bit.
But I think the question then, in regards to voluntary healthcare, would be, to what extent does introducing this voluntary healthcare system put pressure on some of the increase in cost that you're talking about?
Yes.
Because let's say in a single payer system, if you introduce, let's say, government healthcare, government ideally would be able to go to the hospitals and say, look, I'm going to put a cap on how much you can charge. And if you don't like it, you can opt out. They have no other choices. But now, if let's say a private hospital were to say, okay, this particular insurance company can come in and say, look, I'm offering you this. I said, I don't like this payment. I can go to another insurance company and get a higher sort of like rate for the same operation and whatnot. So the cost concerns is something that we need to really study at a much more deeper level.
Yeah, we need the experts to do that.
All right, so this is from Jan Yuan. For senior citizens, the increment in allowance was only RM50 to RM350 a month. What does the panel think the government should do as a long-term measure to ensure that senior citizens are taken care of?
Pensions.
We've actually had, under Tier 50, we've actually, I don't want to disclose too much.
Sure.
We did have discussions about the possibility of universal basic income. UBI, or some form of it. And all the factors that we were talking about before, the fact that the family structure is breaking down, the fact that a lot of people aren't getting married. We have to have some kind of system in place to actually take care of people in their old age. At some stage we're going to have to start really seriously thinking about that one and actually look at options to actually do that because it's not that far away. We're talking about just 15, 20 years down the road.
Yes.
Actually, I'm also curious. What do you think about the relative success of private retirement schemes? Because that's supposed to cover some of the shortfall. But I don't really see it really taking off.
It doesn't take off because it requires you to have excess disposable income to actually save, right? So it only benefits primarily those people who are I would say anybody who's above 8,000 or 10,000 ringgit per month will probably be able to benefit from PRS. And we've seen that in terms of the take-up. It's less than, I can't remember the exact number, it's something like 200, 300,000 people. And most of them just go up to the level of the matching government contribution.
So get the tax rate.
And get the tax rate.
Ching, in your opinion, what do you think about the PRS? From a consumer's perspective?
No, I think I agree. I think it benefits a certain segment of people. I think it definitely encourages that segment to invest more and put aside. But as a scheme to address the larger problem, I think it's not perfect.
Yeah. All right. So here's one from Li Lian Kong. There has been a 1.6 billion increase for Ministry of Higher Education this year. Why the sudden change from the cuts it has been suffering the past few years? MOHE says this will boost the sector, especially in research, development and commercialization, RDC. Do you agree?
I think that the restoration of the budget to the universities was probably as a result of the outcry that emerged last year when about 2 billion ringgit was cut from the budgets of the public universities.
Right.
So I think this is not really an increase that is very significant in the sense that it just restores whatever was taken away from the public universities last year. So whether or not these universities can produce, I think remains to be seen how they incentivize the various lecturers to produce good academic research. But I think it's not really an increase that suddenly it's 2 billion, 1.6 billion on top of whatever they were getting 2-3 years before. It's just restoring whatever budget they had 2 years ago.
Right.
Well, my wife's a lecturer, so. I would say I think the education blueprint actually had a roadmap in terms of getting the public universities to self-fund more of
Financial
themselves.
autonomy.
But obviously it takes time. So I think this is more a case of buying time for them to actually make that shift because it takes a bit to actually shift the mindsets and get the kind of capability and capacity to actually provide research to the private sector and earn grants that way, rather than having the government providing everything.
Put this way, how many people will contribute to endowment funds for public universities? The amount is very low.
Fair point.
Yeah, I think on this count, it just restores to the funding levels to what was there before.
Right.
I mean, if you look granularly in terms of where the cuts took place, I mean, it took place in terms of programs. So if you have institutes or faculties within a university, what they were left with after the previous budget cuts was just basically getting things running, paying salaries and overheads. And so they didn't have any programs, funding for programs or any additional research. So this basically just restores maybe a part of that. And I think given that we're heading into an election, it does, I think, assuage some of the concerns, it improves the morale a bit and that people are not too stressed. Because we know that from the current year's experience, many lecturers and department heads, they have to fork out their own cash because yes, they want financial autonomy. They are supposed to be looking for grants. But all of these are time consuming, and like you say, it takes time. It takes building trust and capacity and so on. And having 15-20% budget cut, it's quite debilitating for many institutions.
True.
Yeah, conducting a research takes what, 6 months, a year?
Yeah,
plus?
sometimes 2 or 3 years, depending on the seriousness of the research. And even organizing simple seminars to bring scholars from outside. You don't have that.
Money,
it costs money.
Interesting. All right, now here's another one from Sebastian Loh. Sebastian Loh, you're a fan. two questions for Hisham, but I think all of us can sort of chip in here. So, firstly, is the ringgit on the road to recovery now? And did the 1MDB fiasco lead to the ringgit's plunge? Is it still keeping the ringgit weak? Is there any statistical evidence for this?
Okay, I will put it this way: that there is some. The ringgit is undervalued, but not as undervalued as most people think it is.
Okay.
My estimate is roughly around 5 to 7%.
Okay.
So from here, where we are now, I think it should be around 4 to the US dollar rather than 4.2 to 4.3. The other aspect of it is that most of this movement is actually coming from the US dollar, not the ringgit. Okay. Did 1MDB have an effect? Yes, it did.
Okay.
But it was quite short-lived. I think about roughly around 9 months or so. Yeah. Roughly around the point of time of the WSJ article coming out and the sale of EDRA.
Okay.
And it did have an effect then, as far as what my studies are concerned. But since then, no. I think the biggest issue that foreign investors have with the ringgit right now is they're scared of Bank Negara. Literally.
Because of changes in regulatory policies.
Correct. So they're looking at it as regulatory risk more than anything else. So they're quite cautious about buying into ringgit assets because of that. More than anything else.
Okay.
And the clamp down on the non-deliverable.
And but I can understand the argument that they were making, but it could have been done a bit more smoothly.
Spook the market.
They did spook them.
Interesting. Though. Ibrahim, from the views on the ground, do they see? Do they align with what Hisham has just shared with us?
I think there's a big dichotomy in terms of what the macro numbers are, in terms of the well-being of the economy, the strength of our currency, and that the mood on the ground. The mood on the ground is much more pessimistic, much more negative compared to what we are seeing in terms of the stats. And I think people have longer reference frames. They remember the time when the ringgit was
2.5
or 2.5, where it was 20 years ago.
When they travel overseas.
And then when they travel overseas, they find that they get very little when they convert. And but the point is, people generally are still. I think the diminution in terms of wealth and all that, I think is very minimal. And for many people that are cutting back, it's cutting back from 4 trips annually to London to maybe 3 trips or something like that. For people who can afford, but for people on the ground, I think there has been a discernible impact in terms of, say, the price of items that they have to purchase. For example, say milk. We know that from some of our work, that the sale of, say, 1 kilogram infant formula has declined, but the sale of half-kilo packs have increased. So which means that families are adjusting by buying smaller portions of things that are considered expensive. And those are things that are imported, they're not produced locally. So purchase of import items, I think, have declined somewhat.
If I can just add to that, one of the issues is that there's a slight perception problem here, in the sense that it's not really the ringgit that's affecting prices of these products.
Okay.
It's more a case of that the global prices of these products are rising.
Right.
And it's expensive for everybody, not just Malaysians.
Right.
And we can specify it. If you look it up in the CPI, the detailed CPI,
right,
it's there.
Okay.
Milk is rising, eggs are rising, seafood is rising.
Yes.
I think the only exception is chicken.
Yeah,
beef is rising.
Beef
has gone up crazy.
I think cabbage rolls, right?
And part of that is simply because over the past 15 years, we've had China developing, we've had India developing, and all these people are coming out of poverty and they're changing their diets, and they're putting stress on food supplies.
Okay.
And same thing, infant formula. I mean, because the base is milk.
All right.
And
Wanting more New Zealand and
New
Australia.
Zealand, Australia, and the Australians and New Zealanders are benefiting from that.
Right.
But it is a global issue rather than a Malaysian issue per se. And if you actually look at the prices of imported items that DOS actually produces on a detail level, we can see that on a average basis, there's been almost no increase in import prices.
Okay.
Right? It's not imported inflation. It's the fact that the commodities themselves are rising.
Right. Interesting.
It's not the ringgit. I mean, the ringgit is basically a perception. The ringgit's falling. Something must be going wrong, right? But if you actually dig down into the details,
Right.
it's something quite different that's going on.
But I mean, most of the voters,
It's still a cost of living issue.
most of
Yes.
voters don't really look at the details of
Yeah.
the CPI. What they
That's
feel
the
is that
issue.
inflation has gone up and disposable income for them has gone down.
And it's true. And that has happened.
Right. But also, I guess that's why they sort of feel the so-called burden, because they're closer to the CPI, right? It means food and non-alcoholic beverages are going up.
Yeah.
It's basically essentials, right? That are going up.
Fuel and transportation as well.
Yeah. All right. So now, second, the government has often highlighted its successes in reducing the national deficit. However, the opposition has argued that the figure, i.e., the deficit, doesn't take into account so-called contingent liabilities. So when we think about Sebastian, I hope you're watching us.
That's a good question.
Yeah, so when we think about deficit reduction, is it fair or necessary to take into account these contingent liabilities?
You go first.
Okay, I'm heretic. I don't think deficit reduction is necessary. Okay, and I don't think fiscal consolidation is strictly speaking necessary either.
Okay.
Okay, I think we need to. It's more a case of what kind of public goods and services that we want the government to deliver and how do you finance that, right? The deficit alone is not really an issue as long as we're running a current account surplus.
Okay.
Because that means the country as a whole is earning more than it produces. Well, it's producing more than it's spending.
Right.
So a deficit, a government deficit in that context is okay.
Okay.
Okay. If we run into a current account deficit, then yes, we need to pull back. Right? So in that sense, I think again, I'm a heretic. I don't. Sure.
Yeah, it's fine.
It's not important to me.
And I disagree with him.
Yeah,
I think I wouldn't look so much at the current account. I would look at whether the government is capable of paying the interest rate on the debt.
Right.
Right now, debt is interest rate on the debt has increased to about 30 billion a year.
15%
Yes.
OPEX.
But it does not take into account future debt financing obligations, which is what Sebastian is talking about. The contingent liabilities would include, for example, debt that you have to issue to build the MRT, the LRT3, the LRT extension, the high-speed rail, ECRL. All these things cost money. They don't appear, not even one single cent appears on the budget in terms of development expenditure. In terms of development expenditure, it would come back in through interest payments.
Yes. Technically, from what they told me, technically it comes through the grants to stat bodies.
Grants to statutory bodies. Yeah. So that would increase over time. And if, let's say, at one point in time we find that we cannot pay this amount, then I think the government would be in trouble, and then we would have to cut down on a lot of the other expenditure stuff. Yes, I think that is my major concern.
Well, I don't know.
And the number is not small. It's contingent liabilities is probably more than 200 billion now by the end of the year.
About 180, and then I think it's going to break 200 next year.
Not all of it is worrisome debt. So, for example, whatever Khazanah owes, that's in the contingent liabilities, they are more than capable of financing it. TNB, for example, they are more than capable of financing it. But others like Prasarana, Dana Infra, which issues all the infrastructure bonds, and
PTPTN.
Yes, PTPTN. That's about 50 billion whole there. So all these things are much more concerning to me than the current account surplus that I'm missing.
But is it fair though, if you look at overall situation today, it's still manageable?
Okay, just let me put this into context. Because one of the problems that we have is that we're fairly transparent in terms of saying we've got these contingent liabilities, whereas a lot of other countries don't. The worst number that I've seen is 1,000% of GDP. That's Poland. Yeah. And they have the exact same credit rating as the United States. I don't know why. The United States has roughly 100% of GDP in government guarantees alone, whereas our levels are around 17.
Yeah, but the advantage is that they issue bonds in US dollars.
So if you do comparative among other governments, then it's not so bad. Obviously, an increase is could be a future issue in terms of fiscal sustainability, but I'm a heretic.
Yeah. Speaking of the whole PTPTN, right? Ching, why do you think some students are struggling to pay off their loans? What's
there's definitely that pressure on the costs, right? So, I think it's good that obviously government has extended the grace period, but that goes to show that they're having trouble collecting, right? And I think there is on one part, a question mark on whether there is that sort of mechanism that encourage people to pay back, and whether we should look more into that. But there's also a real concern around affordability, right? So students entering the workforce, starting pay, and we talked about cost of living of everything going up. So I think it is a real issue.
Yeah, and interesting though. I mean, one of the alternative budget proposals was to wait for the
income contingent repayments. It's something that's being practiced in most developed countries, and our proposal is that if you don't, as somebody who has just graduated, if you don't earn above 4,000 ringgit, you don't have to start repaying your PTPTN loans. Only after you earn more than 4,000 ringgit, then do you start. And I think just want to add a little bit more on the reason why students don't pay. Firstly, youth unemployment is growing, and graduate unemployment is also growing. It's over 10% now, and I think even those who get employed, their sort of like financial priorities would be, look, I just graduated, I want to go to work. If I can have a job, what's the first thing that I want to do? I want to buy a car. Right, so they will use the money to finance cars, maybe credit cards, and then PTPTN comes last. Right, so there's the impression that I don't really need to prioritize PTPTN loans, and I don't really think that's healthy. But I think it's a reflection of the fact that they don't earn enough, and they can't. Many of them choose not to service their loans or can't service their loans.
Yeah, what do you have to say?
Well, I mean, the proposal to make it income contingent is very popular. I mean, this is also part of the campaign, heading into the 2013 election. So it's, I think, immensely popular proposition from the opposition. But I think the big question mark with the rest of the electorate is whether or not the country can afford something like this. Right. And number two, what strategies are in place to address the youth unemployment? Because if you look at the other part of the budget about, say, vocational training and so on, the actual allocation there is fairly small, and the scholarship for TVET is only about 4.5 million ringgit. And so there is a bit of a problem here, in the sense that you have a lot of people going into universities, coming out with little employment opportunities, and they immediately start their so-called careers with debt, and then immediately within 6 or now maybe 12 months they have to start paying on those debt. It doesn't go far away, and I think this is going to be a problem that we will be discussing about for years to come until everybody's income rise beyond a certain level.
All right, so I guess we're down to our last two questions. So the first one is from Lilian Kong. Did budget 2018 do enough in terms of providing affordable housing at the rate that they are needed in our major cities today?
Short answer, no.
I think the government is trying very hard to use different means to provide, first of all, affordable housing to the civil servants.
Right.
I think it's a good move, but also that comes with certain debt obligations. The government, what many people don't realize is that the government actually took out the liabilities of civil servants housing from its actual budget deficit, and then parked it under a corporatized entity.
That's right.
Yes. So that I think is good, but we need to also realize the financial implications of that. And I think in terms of really pushing for something that you hinted at just now, construction workers.
Yes.
The government is trying to push for this IBS industrialized building systems incentives, so that you can decrease the overall reliance on foreign workers, as well as also decrease the construction costs. But that actually needs more capital investment on the part of the developers, and we'll have to wait and see to see whether the developers do
I
respond.
think only a couple of them can actually do it right now.
Yeah, because they don't have the facilities to actually build those IBS systems to
But you need economies of scale as well,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
In order to go
China
together.
can do it, Malaysia,
Yeah.
we're not at that stage yet.
Yeah, sure. Come, yeah.
No, I mean, you look at the whole issue of affordable housing, and I don't think it's something that the federal government can do on its own, frankly.
Okay.
You need to have state involvement,
Right.
and everybody needs to sit down and figure out the cost structures and everything. That's one reason why I think we need to really look at reforming state finance as well.
Okay.
Because of that reliance on property income, that has a contributory effect on housing costs.
All right.
Because
and
of
you
land
need-
costs.
Yeah, exactly.
Land costs.
So you need to have everybody in that discussion. The federal government on its own can only do so much. So the budget alone is not, I would say, is not really the proper vehicle for addressing this.
All right. Right, but interesting though. I think what was unveiled in the budget was a step-up financing for private developers, right? So will this actually increase? Could it potentially raise non-performing loans or household debt? Indeed? Because now technically you're extending it to people.
I don't think financing is the issue.
Yeah.
So we really need to look at all the other factors involved in housing costs. So it's a well, I hesitate to say it's a band-aid, but it is just basically interim step at best.
But I would say financing comes in maybe on the demand side. If you have a lot of people who can't afford to borrow loans, for example, because Bank Negara has changed the regulations from total income to, let's say, disposable income or net income, that definitely would have an effect on the
You
demand
need
side.
to address supply.
Supply. Yeah?
Yes.
All right. Okay, and then I guess our last question is also from Lilian Kong, who's also a fan of ours. What does Budget 2018 hold for youth? Have the issue of, I think we're talking about youth unemployment been addressed?
I think in terms of youth unemployment, you need to look at two things. I think Ben talked about the technical and vocational education. I think on that part, we would need to look at the over-reliance on foreign workers, because if you have still the large number of foreign workers coming in, whatever TVET graduates that you're producing, they will be competing against the foreign workers, and the wages would still be artificially kept low.
Yeah.
And then the other issue about TVET is that you need to really build good linkages with the industry. Do the kind of German vocational training, even on the job.
Okay.
That's something that the Penang State government is trying to do now. Last year, the Penang State government started a 20 million program to do that kind of industry training and to pay wages for these TVET graduates, even while they are working, to work in some of the MNCs that are based in Penang. Of course, that's a relatively small project, but if let's say the federal government can expand it to something that's much more cohesive and much bigger, I think it will help, especially on the TVET side.
Interesting though. I guess with automation and all coming in, right? There's this whole worry of unemployment and and all that, right? Should parents be thinking about, planning for the children's education to meet these demands? Or should you just go and wing it?
I would put it this way: the best thing you can do is teach the child how to learn.
And how to think.
Because we can't predict what kind of jobs are going to be popular 10 years from now or 20 years from now.
Exactly.
Right? And because lifespans are getting extended, the possibility actually arises of having 2 or 3 careers in a lifetime.
Right.
Right? So what I think is more important is to be able to teach, rather than putting them, okay, you have to do coding, you have to do this, you have to do that. I'd rather teach them how to learn, and they will, do that themselves.
Okay.
If you're putting somebody in and asking them to be a science graduate, and then you put them into an English language course, it doesn't help.
Yeah.
Obviously, the communications, and you look at communications, for example, the social skills and everything. All of that happens in essentially the first 5 years of life, right? And that's even before the school system starts.
True.
Right? So that part of the education system we need to emphasize, I think.
And you have the issue of inculcating higher order thinking skills or HOTS. But one of the major challenges we find in universities as well as in pre-tertiary level is that teachers themselves are not encouraged to think critically. Lecturers themselves, if they think too critically, maybe certain sectors may not like that. So how are they going to pass on that kind of high order thinking skills to students if they themselves are caught in that trap? Lecturers as well as teachers. So I think that's an important issue which has not really been addressed in our education policies.
Right. You guys want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think that's one. And number two is that as a small country that doesn't have the economic base in order to sell to ourselves, we have to export our skills, export our products elsewhere. I think people also need to strengthen the bit on communication and see how they can tap China and India as two growing markets, and then see ourselves as in the middle, trying to benefit from the growth of these two giant neighbors. And therefore, there's a need to rethink our educational nationalism as well. That our youngsters need to have not just the critical thinking, but also marketable skills. Simplest of which is language.
Yes.
I think we have a diversity here that can aid in that process, and I think we need the courage to be and political will to do this. And this is something that we feel it's a bit in Malaysia tequilan, in the sense that it's a loss because we've done a lot of surveys. Our work is daily work is just surveys. We've actually polled parents, and majority and in the excess of 70% want the Malay parents want their kids to learn Mandarin, want their kids to learn Tamil, English, and so on. There's no nationalism when it comes to education, and that's what parents tell us. But yet people in charge of these policies, implementing it, I think are still wedded to old modes of thinking.
The industrial school system. That needs to change. There's in Finland now. There's no syllabus.
Yes, that's what's coming up right now.
I don't think we're at the stage yet.
But I think actually, I was going to say, the one thing we can guarantee is that technology is going to bring about change, right?
Yes.
And I've worked in technology for the last few years. It's scary sometimes how things can change, right? And
How
the one
fast
thing,
things change.
exactly.
And you have to have flexible people to be able to adjust to that kind of environment. If we have this kind of system where you think a certain way, you know a certain knowledge, it's not going to work.
I think it's about preparing and planning for the unknown.
Yes.
Right? Yeah, that's always the key.
Yeah, and the scary thing about changes in technology is that those who are most able to capitalize on it are those living in urban areas who are in relative affluence, the middle class. You talk about those living in the rural areas in Sabah and Sarawak. Whatever changes in technology you have, they are not going to be able to really feel the impact of it, at least not in the kind of environment that we're in right now.
Excellent. All right. I guess that's all we have for today. Thanks, guys, for being here. Norisham of VPF, Ong Kian Penang Institute, Ching, iMoney, and University Medical Center. All right, guys, thanks for joining us. Do tune in to our Facebook page for the video later, and if you love us, like the Facebook page, follow us. Thanks again for joining us. Bye.
Bye.